Hi everybody! This video will introduce you to the first novel we're reading for this class, which is Pride and Prejudice. Before I get started talking about the novel, however, I want to spend a few minutes talking about Jane Austen. Jane Austen was born in December 1776 to Reverend George Austen and Cassandra Lee Austen. She was the second daughter and the seventh child of the couple. And she was especially close to her oldest sister, Cassandra. And we see this life experience reflected in Austen's novels. Many of her novels, including Pride and Prejudice, feature large families with a lot of sisters. And they often feature sisters who have really close relationships, just like Jane Austen had with her own sister, Cassandra. Austen's father was a clergyman, which means that he was a pastor or reverend. And the family was well connected, so they had relations that were sort of fairly well to do, but they themselves were not wealthy. So in some ways they're very similar to the family of the Bennets that we see in Pride and Prejudice. They lived very modestly on a small salary that he drew from his work, as well as some supplementary income that he earned from farming and tutoring boys from wealthier families. And one of the most important relationships that we know about in Austen's life was a man that she met in 1796. This was Tom Lefroy. He had just finished university and he was planning to train as a barrister, which is the British term for lawyer, in London. And in Austen's letters, she describes him as a very gentlemanlike, good-looking, pleasant young man, and even stated that she expected an offer of marriage from him. However, his family intervened and sent him away, and Jane never saw him again. A second important incident in her life happened in 1802, when she received an offer of marriage from Harris Bigwither, which is a very British name, who was a family friend. And she initially accepted the offer as it would have provided her with a home and financial stability, something that we see popping up in Pride and Prejudice. However, she changed her mind the following day, and she never married, and as far as we know, she never had any romantic entanglements after that. Her first novel, Sense and Sensibility, was published in 1811. And Pride and Prejudice, the novel that we're reading, came soon after that, 2 years after that. And then after that, she published Mansfield Park and Emma, which we're also reading for this class. We think that she had been writing drafts of these works for quite some time before this, though. So in 1811, she actually sort of starts publishing these works that she's been writing about and thinking about for some time. And in 1817, so only 6 years after her first novel was published, her health began deteriorating, and she died the following year. So she died very young. Her last two novels, Persuasion and Northanger Abbey, were then published after her death in 1818. So now I'll talk a little bit about Pride and Prejudice. So Austen wrote an early version of Pride and Prejudice called First Impressions between October 1796 and August 1797. We don't have a copy of this work, so we don't really know how much she changed it when she wrote Pride and Prejudice, but we do know that it was an epistolary novel. So this means that it was the first version of Pride and Prejudice, called First Impressions, was a novel that was completely composed of letters between people. So she must have made some significant changes when she turned it into the novel that we know today. First Impressions, that version of the novel, was offered to a publisher in November of 1777, but the first publisher refused it. And then after she had successfully published Sense and Sensibility, she returned to that earlier novel and revised it. And then she published that as Pride and Prejudice in 1813. Which was 16 years after the publisher had rejected First Impressions. So this sort of manuscript or this idea sat on her so-called desk for quite some time. And she probably revised it significantly when she wrote Pride and Prejudice. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about what kind of novel Pride and Prejudice is. And I think it can arguably fall into three different categories, although not everyone would agree with me on this. So the kind of novel, or the way that we often think about the novel, especially now, is as a romance. This is a novel in which an attractive woman meets a handsome, rich man who initially seems to dislike her, but eventually comes to love her. And then they have a bunch of misunderstandings and obstacles, but they realize they love each other and get married. So in this way, it's sort of almost a prototypical romantic comedy. Very similar to, in lots of ways, to the kinds of plots that we're familiar with today from, movies and other books. It can also be seen as a proto-feminist work, although there are plenty of scholars who would disagree with this claim. Elizabeth Bennet is self-educated, she's witty, and she's independent. And unlike some female protagonists of the time, so unlike some of the women who pop up in novels of the time, she has a more sort of independent spirit, and she's willing to sort of shirk the expectations of her family and of the people around her. And in this way, we can see her as this sort of early feminist or proto-feminist figure. And then the last way to see this novel that I think is especially important is to see it as a work of social satire. So in addition to being about, this sort of spirited young woman and being about a love story, it's also supposed to be really funny, and it's supposed to make fun of a lot of the expectations and social customs that were a big part of Austen's life. So there's a lot of ridiculous characters that we're supposed to laugh at. And these ridiculous characters are drawn from, the kinds of people that were in Austen's world and that she was seeing around her. So in some ways, she's making fun of certain kinds of people and certain kinds of social customs and certain expectations. And we'll be talking about that in this class as well as the other things. So before I let you go, I want to give you some questions to help guide your reading. And these are questions that we'll be talking about in our discussions. So it's good to sort of have these on hand and be thinking about, what are parts of the novel, what are specific passages that can help us answer these questions. So the first question I want you to consider is, what kind of relationship do Mr. and Mrs. Bennet have? So these are Elizabeth's parents. So would you call their relationship a happy marriage? And then why or why not? What details help us, what details highlight their relationship and what kind of marriage they have? The second question has to do with also something that happens in the first chapter. So Mr. Bennet repeatedly describes his younger daughters, Lydia and Kitty, as silly. I think he'll call Mary that as well. So I want you to think about what he means by that. When he says they're silly, what is he talking about? What sort of aspects of their personalities and their character is he referring to? And then how are Jane and Elizabeth different from these younger sisters? What set them apart? What makes them not silly, according to Mr. Bennet? And then I also want you to be paying attention to the relationship that develops between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. So what are Elizabeth's and Mr. Darcy's first impressions of one another? And remember that this novel, or at least the first version of this novel, was called First Impressions. So that's an important part of this novel, an important theme in this novel. How do these impressions change over the course of Volume 1 as you're reading it? And then I want you to be thinking about also how other characters view Elizabeth. So how do various characters, and I'm thinking about Elizabeth's own sisters and mother, but also Miss Bingley and the people in Netherfield, how do they respond to Elizabeth's decision to walk to Netherfield to visit her sick sister? This is in chapter 8. And what do these reactions reveal about these different characters' views and how women should behave? So what kind of expectations do the characters in the novel seem to have about how women should behave and who sort of women should be within society? Okay, and then related to that, the chapters following this visit, so chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11, describe several conversations between Mr. Bingley, Miss Bingley, and Mr. Darcy about what is desirable in a woman. And I want you to pay attention to this conversation, and I want you to be thinking about what qualities each character thinks a woman should cultivate, and how do these differ? So what qualities does Mr. Darcy think a woman should cultivate? What qualities does Miss Bingley think a woman should cultivate? And what qualities does Elizabeth think a woman should cultivate? And then I also want you to be paying attention to Mr. Collins, who is this sort of ridiculous character that shows up in Volume 1. And the narrator, as I say here, presents Mr. Collins as an object of ridicule We're supposed to find him ridiculous and be laughing at him. So what are some of the personality traits and behaviors that the reader is supposed to find ridiculous? Why are we supposed to be laughing at him? What is supposed to be ridiculous about him? And then related to that, what qualities does Mr. Collins seem to want in a wife? What is he looking for in a life partner? And how do these qualities compare to the qualities that Mr. Darcy says he values in a woman? And then I want you to be thinking about also why Elizabeth refuses Mr. Collins' proposal. And she tells him no when he asked her to marry her. And what is motivating this, right? Everybody around her thinks that she should marry him, but she doesn't. So what's her reasoning for that? Why does she think that he is an unsuitable sort of partner, and what are her problems with him as a potential husband? And then why does her friend Charlotte accept Mr. Collins' proposal? So what is her reasoning? And I want you to think about the differences between these two women and what their reasoning is. It's very easy to see Charlotte as an unsympathetic character, but I actually see her as sort of very sympathetic in some ways. So think about what is her reasoning. What is the argument she makes in favor of marrying this ridiculous man? And then last but not least, I want you to pay attention to Elizabeth's impressions of Mr. Wickham. So coming back to this theme of first impressions, what is her sort of first reaction to Mr. Wickham? And when he starts telling her all these stories about Mr. Darcy, why does she believe him? Why does she sort of get onto his side? Okay, so I think that's enough to get you going for this first week and for Volume 1. I'm going to look forward to seeing what you guys have to say in your journals about this novel, and I will be talking more about it in the following weeks.